Viewer and listener discretion is advised. Continuing Stitches by A.G. Howard. 3. Gingerbread Man. Pa and I decided there was no better time than the present to earn our first payment. He grabbed the bottle of sedatives the collector had provided, along with a canning jar filled with moonshine. Clover and Oakley stayed in the house due to the storm clouds rolling in. Pa and I walked together out to the shed. He even chose the saw. It felt so strange, him handing me a weapon after being one himself for so many years. It was like an offering, a penance, and I was ready and willing to take the payment. I didn't have the proper tools. I didn't have the proper experience. What I did have was the ability to imagine myself in another time and place. Ma used to call me her fanciful girl because I could pretend so intensely I would lose myself and forget everything around me. It came in especially handy when she had to stitch something up, like the gash I got on my forehead when I was 8 and Pa pushed me into the barbed wire fence that surrounded the garden. My fault for not doing the weeding right. "You're just my little gingerbread girl," Ma chanted softly as I cried, then explained how the stitches were little scallops of white icing that would hold me together so I'd be in one piece and pretty. After Pa drank half the moonshine to wash down 2 pills, I helped him climb onto his cleared-off workbench. He rolled up his pant leg, fingers slow and awkward from the drowsiness, until his left ankle was exposed. Then I tied down his hands and feet to keep him still, for his own good. Saw in hand, I was no longer Sage Adams, looming over the prone form of my wretched, troubled Pa. I was a baker in Paris, slicing up a gingerbread man. The spurt of blood that slicked my fingers as the saw ground back and forth, the curling of flesh and the cracking of bones became raspberry filling, marzipan coating, and cookie dough burned too crisp around the edges. Once Pa passed out, and with only the swell of the wren's songs and the storm brewing outside, nothing could distract me from my imaginary bakery. Not the sweat drizzling along my brow, not the coppery tang of fresh blood, not the ache in my hand, biceps, and forearm from sawing so long to get through that bone. Only when his foot plopped onto the pillow of newspaper I'd arranged to catch it did I drag myself back to reality. My stomach turned. I bent over and threw up, but was careful to aim away from the $10,000 foot. During the hot and cold sweats that followed, I cauterized his mutilated stump as the card had instructed. I used the hot iron, the one Clover pressed our clothes with and made her hair straight with so Oakley and Pa could tell us apart. The sizzle and stench of burned skin made me nauseous again. I chewed the lovage root the collector had supplied. It eased my stomach before I spit the soggy clump from my mouth and packed it around the wound to prevent scar tissue from forming. The room spun as I wrapped the amputated foot into a heavy plastic bag and placed it in the ice chest. Wiping my bloody hands on a dust rag, I escaped, leaving Pa to sleep off the sedatives in the garden shed. I returned to the cottage carrying an ice chest worth more money than I'd ever seen, all for 2 hours' worth of labor. That is, unless you counted the lifetime it took for Pa to grow it. At the sink, I washed my hands until the water no longer ran red and gurgled salt water to rinse the taste of vomit and lovage root from my mouth. Clover and Oakley had fallen asleep. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wrens had silenced. Not many people realize the truth about wrens. They may be smaller than a kitten's head, but they're brave. Stare down their mortal enemy, beak to fangs, if their home or hatchlings are threatened. Maybe Pa had been watching those birds since Ma had been gone, because he'd finally stared down his enemy in a way most men would never have had the brass to try. That night, I dropped into bed and dreamed of life-size gingerbread houses made of human legs and arms, held together by stitches of red licorice that were actually blood veins. Instead of gumdrops and jellied candies decorating the windows, there were organs. Hearts, lungs, kidneys, all dripping and fresh from their corpses. The sidewalk leading to the house was made of hollow bones that rolled beneath my feet with a teeth-jarring crunch. The collector showed up the next day to pay us and trade the red and white ice chest for a blue one containing Pa's new piece. He'd also handed me a small tub of regenerative ointment. The handwritten label listed ground salamander hearts as the main ingredient and claimed that by slathering it on the cadaver's parts' raw edges, it would regenerate Pa's skin and bones to the donor foot once it was stitched into place with the hemp thread provided. I found that stitching went easier than the cutting off. I only had to pretend I was piecing a broken cookie together with icing. It took Pa 3 months to heal enough to use the foot, so we decided everything would have to come off one at a time. One foot, and then the next after the replacement healed. One ear, then the other. One eyeball, one hand, and so on. There was also some adjusting, since his cadaver donor was 2 sizes smaller than Pa. But we accepted each new and improved body part along with the money without flinching, because the transplants were going to make him a better man. Like Ma had always said, beggars can't be choosers. And we would never be beggars again. Over the next 3 years, the collector's drop-offs and pickups became as ordinary an occurrence as doing laundry or mopping the floor. The experiment was working. The donor's blue eyeballs that replaced Pa's gray ones helped him see without his reading glasses. With his new tongue, he spoke softer, kinder, and he never cursed. After the ear exchange, Pa listened closer to everything we'd say. Who cared if his ears were smaller? He never ignored us or forgot the important things. That's all that mattered. Well, that and the money. Pa had always loved Ma's cooking. I'd taken over kitchen duties, and in time, as Pa started changing, I started wanting to use her recipes. Maybe because it made him smile, and I'd forgotten what he looked like when he was happy. Now that we had a steady income, I didn't lack for fresh ingredients. Once Clover and I were of driving age, we took the truck to town and did the shopping. Pa rarely left the house. He was too self-conscious about the scars. There was no reason for him to leave anyway. We'd fixed up the house real pretty and had a proper stove. We'd even bought Oakley a swing set and a fort for playing cowboys and Indians. Over time, I started to notice that, quiet as he was, the collector had a kind heart. He always stopped to play with Oakley in his fort when he came by. And he also gave us gifts. Not the kinds that were expensive, but the kinds that meant something. He gave Oakley a real set of binoculars and showed him how to use them to scope out a giant hawk from the roof of his fort. He gave Clover new eye teeth on a dental fixture connected to a retainer. And me, I got an endless supply of cherry licorice. Anytime I ran out, he'd bring more. I started to make a habit of baking fresh gingerbread men on the days he was expected. Each time, I wrapped some up, careful, and insisted that he take them home. I found myself talking to him a lot, even though he never talked back. Until finally, one day, he pulled out a memo pad and pen from his jacket and began to respond through notes written awkwardly with his clawed mitten. It was almost like hearing his voice, reading that messy script. My favorite thing to do was to tell him jokes. He'd always snort through his nostril holes and write, "You have me in stitches." Later, I would come to see the irony in that statement.